When Steve Jobs resigned as CEO of Apple in 2011, many people were wondering who would be the best candidate for the job. Some names were tossed around, but in the end, it was Tim Cook who got the nod. It was going to be big shoes to fill because Jobs was such an iconic figure, not just for Apple, but for the entire tech industry. But Cook was up for the challenge. Since Apple announced Cook as their new CEO, Apple's stock price has risen by nearly 1,000%, and it has become the world's largest company with a $2 trillion market cap. In other words, more than 90% of Apple's current market value was created during Cook's tenure. If Apple founder Jobs created a vision, Cook turned the vision into a reality. So why did Steve Jobs choose Tim Cook? What did Cook do to make Apple the powerhouse it is today? In today's video, we'll go over Cook's rise to prominence. The story starts about a decade ago. In 2011, Apple lost one of the world's most admired CEOs, Steve Jobs. Although it was no secret that Jobs was severely ill, the abrupt death of a genius shocked the world, including Tim Cook. It was revealed in Jobs' biography that Cook, at the time of Jobs' passing, had officially taken over as CEO at the time. However, it was believed by most that Jobs, as a board member, would still guide product development behind the scenes for a long time. Jobs' death suddenly brought in a host of problems for Apple that they were somewhat unprepared for. The biggest issue was that Jobs was the heart and soul of Apple. He was the visionary who created products that people didn't even know they wanted. Now, without him, there were fears that Apple would lose its way and that Cook, as an operations guy, won't be able to fill those shoes. Another big problem was that Jobs has left behind some unfinished business. Even though the iPhone 4S has just been released, there were already rumors of a new, even better iPhone in the works. This phone became known as the iPhone 5, which was slated to be released in 2012. But with Jobs gone, would Apple be able to pull it off? Well, the answer, as we know right now, is a resounding yes. The iPhone 5 was a huge success and is widely considered to be one of the best iPhones ever made. And it was followed by several other successful iPhones, including the best-selling iPhone 6. So what did Steve Jobs see in Tim Cook that made him believe in him? To understand Jobs' decision, let's take a look at Cook's journey before joining Apple. Cook was born in a working-class family in Mobile, Alabama. In 1978, Cook graduated from high school and chose to study industrial engineering at Auburn University. It was not a popular choice back then, as most students preferred to study finance or law because of their high salary. But Cook had his heart set on industrial engineering because this major studies how to optimize complex systems, perfect for supply chain-related jobs. This niche major made Cook such a rare talent in the technology industry. After graduating from college, Cook went to work for IBM, which was at the height of its power. In the early 1980s, IBM was the undisputed #1 computer company. Computers were sold by the minute, and IBM's supply was always short due to high demand. But Cook didn't join a favorable department at IBM, and instead Cook went to the personal computer or PC department, which was established at that time. Today, PCs are found everywhere and essentially necessary for survival. But 30 or 40 years ago, the proportion of American households who own personal computers were less than 10%. And everyone believed that computers were reserved for business use only. So from an early stage in his professional career, Cook displayed the courage to brave the unknown. After joining IBM, Cook was responsible for supply chain management, which he studied in college. At the time, the US manufacturing industry was influenced by Japanese companies, and all factories were trying to implement Toyota's just-in-time production concept. To put this into layman's term, just-in-time production means that the manufacturing process only begins when there is an order. Rather than making products in bulk and storing them in warehouses, parts were only to be delivered to the assembly line as needed. It was a revolutionary concept, which helped factories reduce waste and save on costs. But it also comes with its own problems. The biggest challenge of just-in-time production is that the entire manufacturing process becomes very fragile. If even one part is late, the whole process will be disrupted. This was a huge risk for IBM because given the high demand, if their factories messed up, they would lose billions of dollars in potential sales. But Tim Cook was up for the challenge. He developed a new way to manage inventory using computers and barcodes, which allowed IBM to track parts in real time and make necessary adjustments quickly. In his 4 years there, Cook was able to prove himself to be an outstanding operations guy. In fact, he was so good that he was poached by Compaq, one of IBM's biggest competitors at the time in 1982. After joining Compaq, Cook was promoted to be the company's manufacturing director in only 4 years. He was responsible for the entire supply chain and production of Compaq products. During his time there, he successfully streamlined the production process and found a new way to make computers a much lower cost than its competitors, which helped Compaq launch the world's first desktop that cost less than $1,000, bringing in billions of dollars in profit to the company. And in 1997, Steve Jobs returned to Apple as its CEO. At the time, Apple was on the brink of bankruptcy and was desperately in need of a turnaround. Jobs needed someone who could help him with the business side of things, and Cook was the perfect candidate. Jobs had been keeping an eye on Cook and was very impressed by his work at Compaq. He knew that Cook would be a valuable asset to Apple, so he poached him from Compaq in 1998. Cook was initially reluctant to leave Compaq because he was comfortable with his current situation. But through the introduction of friends, Cook and Jobs met each other in the late 90s, and they had a talk that lasted for hours. Jobs described the product he was planning to create, which clearly moved Cook and even made him immediately decide to join Apple. His friends and families thought he was crazy because Apple was a company on the verge of bankruptcy at the time, and Compaq was the world's largest computer company. But Cook believed in Jobs and his vision, so he took the risk. It was one of the best decisions he ever made. But turning Apple around was easier said than done. When Cook first joined the company, Apple was losing $1 million a day, and at one point, there were only enough cash available to keep the company going for about 6 months. Dell CEO Michael Dell even said publicly that if he was the CEO of Apple, he would quickly auction off the company's asset and get some money back to the shareholders. But Steve Jobs and Tim Cook weren't ready to give up the company yet. To keep the company afloat, the first thing Cook did at Apple was try streamlining its manufacturing process and reducing its inventory from months to days. However, it wasn't an easy task. At the time, Apple offered a wide range of products, which means more parts were involved in the manufacturing process. Although this helped the company to sell products to a wider customer base, it also required the company to predict demand with extreme accuracy. If the estimate was wrong, the inventory would then be severely over or understocked, creating a substantial issue in either case. In 1993, for example, Apple overestimated market demand and overstocked its PowerBook laptops, which created huge losses for the company. 2 years later, Apple's new Power Mac was so popular that it received 150,000 orders during the pre-sale period. This time, however, Apple underestimated market demand and production orders were too conservative, resulting in $1 billion worth of order failing to be delivered. Upon his return, Jobs believed the key to Apple's future was a complete change in the company's style of operation and production. He appointed Cook to be in charge of Apple's supply chain management. Through outsourcing, Cook helped Apple solve the inventory problem and avoided both overstock and production delay. Under Cook, Apple linked production and manufacturing directly to consumers, improving efficiency. In 1998, 7 months after Cook joined Apple, the inventory turnover was shortened from 30 days to 6 days. The remaining Macintosh inventory fell from $400 million worth to $78 million worth. By the end of 1998, Apple had successfully turned losses into profits. Just the previous year, Apple's net loss was still at $1 billion. Given the stellar performance, by 2002, Cook was appointed to be the head of sales and operations, and 2 years later, he was appointed as the company's COO to oversee the operations of the whole company. Under his leadership, Apple's sales and management expenses fell from 20% of the company's revenue to only 13%. By the time Jobs died in 2011 and Cook officially became Apple's CEO, the expenses have stabilized at about 7% of Apple's revenue, a figure that stands to this day. Cook's strategy in supply chain management successfully helped Apple solve the core problem of a volatile inventory. Cook's second master plan was to help Apple establish a close supply chain partnership. This would reduce Apple's research and development costs extensively. At the time, Apple was still in its early stages of development, but Jobs already had bold ideas. He hoped to use highly automated factories to make products, and he did. Apple spent tons of money building a special, advanced automation factory in the Bay Area in order to produce the first-generation Macintosh. It worked, but unfortunately, Mac sales simply could not cover the cost of the factory, and Apple failed to make ends meet. As a result, it faced the dilemma of bankruptcy. Cook's approach was quite different from Jobs. He chose to outsource Apple's production to a third party. While business slowly resumed in 2007, Cook helped Apple finalize the deal with Foxconn, a third-party supplier in Taiwan. The terms of the partnership were kept confidential, but according to Cook, it was a win-win situation for both parties. With this strategic move, Apple managed to reduce its production cost by 30%. In other words, Apple saves billions of dollars every year, and it's not just about reducing costs. But as a matter of fact, Apple took a fancy to the Taiwanese supplier because Cook always liked Foxconn's flexibility, efficiency, and technology. When Apple selects suppliers, it's considered the company's developmental prospects in addition to the prices. For Apple suppliers, it is not only necessary to meet the tech giant's demanding technological requirements, but also to show Apple its investment in new tech every year. And Apple helps too. In fact, they will often send people to spot check and test the research and development results. Hence, the substantial portion of Apple's research and development funds are shared with the supply chain partner. It's a risk, but one that Cook is willing to take in order to maintain Apple's edge in the market. This is why we often see the best technologies are constantly being used to manufacture Apple's products, which is exactly what Cook wants to see. But why are companies like Foxconn willing to do the hard work for Apple? The answer, of course, is Apple's widespread influence in our world today. Apple's undoubtedly one of the world's biggest brands, and suppliers understand that if their parts are being used for Apple's product, then Apple will bring consistent revenue and prestige to their names. This incentive alone is sufficient for suppliers to invest in research and development and then provide the results to Apple. In the end, Apple always comes out on top. With Cook's shrewd supply chain management, Apple not only saved billions of dollars in production costs, but also gained access to the latest cutting-edge technologies. It's a win-win situation for both parties. In a nutshell, Tim Cook is a master of supply chain management. He has helped Apple save billions of dollars in production costs and gain access to the latest technologies. His approach is both strategic and efficient, and it is one of the reasons why Apple is such a successful company today. Yes, we like to talk about innovation and the next big thing, but without a solid foundation in supply chain management, any innovation would only exist in a lab. At the end of the day, it's a product that gets sent to the consumer that counts, and that's where Tim Cook excels. This is Money Therapy, a channel about money and exciting business stories. If you enjoyed the video, please like and leave a comment, and be sure to subscribe and hit the bell to turn on notifications so you can stay updated on the top tech news today. See you next time!